Right, so hello and welcome. Thank you everybody for submitting your questions. We've got Chris here with us, we're in Nottingham, and Paul Browning in the background, who is our host and our technical support. Sadly Dylan can't be with us, but he has very kindly answered a lot of the questions for us, and Paul is going to intercut those with the responses that Chris is going to give. So Dylan's on a flight, I hope he has a good trip, and we will start going through the questions that you've sent us, so thank you very much. So question number one, Chris, is from Faith Warren, who is asking about differentiating for learning and about the methods that seem to work with smaller, well-behaved groups, and whether or not these would work or other strategies you might put in place for less receptive students.
Well, I mean, it's always a difficult one. You know, we want our students to work with us to move their learning forward, but sometimes it's a matter of just starting off slowly, getting your students moving with a few of the ideas, then gradually building on that as they start to respond better. Because like any students in the classroom, as they start to gain confidence in what they're doing, then the sort of disruptive behaviour tends to decline a little. You just have to use your best teaching skills, which I'm sure you can, Faith.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Chris.
Daniela Lawler rightly points out that differentiation for learning requires teachers to be able to identify where the student is at in the learning process and then adapt teaching to suit this. And the question is, how can teachers be supported to develop efficient ways of managing the complexities of classroom life? And I think the real simple answer is start small. So we're not suggesting that we actually have every aspect of a lesson being differentiated. We're starting, for example, with hinge questions where you just check at one point in a lesson that the students are still with you. And if they are, you move on. If they're not, you do something different. But a simple response might be simply, for example, use a multiple choice question, ask students to choose A, B, C, or D, and then for those who've answered incorrectly, ask them to describe their answers, to explain their answers, or maybe you can do something a bit more formal. For example, if at least 3 students choose each option, you could send the students to the 4 corners of the classroom if you've labelled them A, B, C, D, and then each group try to figure out a way of persuading the students in the other corners of the classroom that their answer is the best. The important point is the hinge point question, if it's a key question, is really worth resolving before moving on.
Okay, our next question from Emma. She's talking she's writing and saying that obviously we've used a lot of different strategies on the course, and she recognises that there are a number of different approaches that she can use. Her question is about what happens in reality. Do we see all of them working alongside each other, or whether we would focus on just one? Her gut feeling, she says, is that focusing on one is more beneficial to allow students to build up that learning and reflective vocab mastery and learning behaviours.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, Emma. I mean, I think any new strategy you try is going to take a little while for your students to get used to, but also for you to realise its potential and the best way to really support those learners when you're doing PACE or, you know, whatever strategy you've actually picked up. So try one, see how it works, a particular group. Try it maybe with another group and see, you know, how that differs or is similar, and then take the best from it and push forward, and then gradually layer the other ones on top as you need them.
Okay, so there you go, Emma, some wise advice there about being persistent and resilient.
Mario Constantino asks how to plan the task for lessons, as in their school they have a curriculum where the curriculum must be completed by the end of the year. And that's a very common problem. Many districts in the United States have pacing guides that tell teachers you have to be on chapter 3 by a certain date. And that does create problems with differentiation. But I think one key way forward is to identify which are the key standards here, which are the really important things that students have to get. So, for example, the particulate nature of matter, it's really important that students understand this because so much of their later science learning will depend on them understanding this. Phases of the moon, it's a nice topic, great fun to teach, but it's actually less important for progression. So the key idea here is that we have to create space for ourselves to make sure that as many students as possible are mastering the really important material, with the less important material being allocated a lower status, not ignored, but it's not quite so important. And the other important point to note is that differentiation doesn't deny there are differences between students. It says there are differences between students, and we're not going to get every single student up to the highest level of achievement. Differentiation is simply a way of making sure that as much time for each student is spent in productive learning.
Moving on to a question from Maria Noalazzo. She says she loved the idea of the PACE quadrant, it caught her eye, but she did notice that in the classroom that we exemplified it, which was our Sarah McNally's classroom, that there was actually one teacher and 3 teaching assistants in the classroom who were each working with a different group. She says that where she works, she doesn't have teaching assistants. How could she, as a single teacher, cope with this kind of lesson? What are your thoughts, Chris?
Well, I've seen it done in classrooms where there aren't teaching assistants, and the teachers manage that quite well. But then again, it's one where the teacher was quite well practiced in using it, so knew her students well, knew the strategy, and knew when support was needed and when it wasn't. I think it is worth trying, because what it does, as you start to use it more, is your students can take over making the decisions about which ones of the quadrants that they will do, and they start to learn how they should go about it. So again, it's like the last one, it's practice, trying to get things better, and persisting with it really until it starts to work well. But you were saying about somebody's done race rather than pace.
Yeah, so somebody, I'm sorry I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was somebody in the comment threads on the course, which is another way to advertise the richness that is there that is additional to what we've planned for you. Somebody was recommending or thinking that they could have a go at doing race, which was recall, apply, correct and extend, rather than our practice, apply, correct and extend. So actually, and this is what I love about teachers, is that they're creative, so we get an idea, and then teachers will think about how they can take that and adapt it for their students.
Yeah, and it might be with one of the STEM subjects that race is better, and maybe with another, maybe maths, pace is better. So
yeah,
it's finding what goes with your subject area as well.
Yeah, so I hope that helps. So thank you very much for your question there, Maria. So moving on, our next question.
Jerry Shelton raises a similar issue. How does one come up with differentiated learning for a curriculum that has the same exams for learners with different abilities? Should every lesson have some differentiated learning provisions? Well, for me, the key idea is that we should have the same learning intentions for every single student in the class. If we're teaching them as a group, if they're in the same classroom, I think we should have the same learning intentions. But we have to recognize that some students will go further than others, so we can differentiate in terms of the success criteria. So you might have a set of activities, and as much as possible is done collaboratively, but we recognize that some students will find it easier to learn this material than others. So differentiate the success criteria by all means, don't differentiate the learning intentions. Tony Glasson also asks about success criteria. She asks, where do success criteria come into play? How do students know and understand what they can and cannot do? This is an aspect of metacognition, knowing what you know, knowing what you don't know, knowing what to do when you're stuck. And there's no doubt that some students are better at this than others. There's no doubt that some students find this easier than others. But the research evidence is that all students can improve their ability to think metacognitively. It can be a slow process, and often it gets bound up with students saying they understand something because they think the teacher wants them to understand something. And so there's an element of dishonesty sometimes, or fooling yourself because you don't want to hold up the class. But what we've discovered in our work with teachers is that as soon as students realize the teacher really wants to find out if students have understood something or not, the students become very honest about their own understandings, and they come to believe that they have the right to understand this material, and if they don't, it's appropriate that they share that with the teacher so the teacher can take the necessary action. Claire Brown asks, how can we cope practically in a classroom with large groups, often little teacher assistant support, and pupils who struggle to work without guidance for academic and behavioural reasons? And as you might expect, there is no simple solution. There's no silver bullet. There's no easy thing that we can say will make a difference. But it's important to recognise that a lot of behaviour problems in classrooms are really curriculum problems. Students are behaving in the way that they are because they don't actually understand what they're being asked to do. And so by differentiating, it's not going to make badly behaved students suddenly into well-behaved students, but it does give the teacher an edge. It makes sure that a greater proportion of the time in the classroom is being spent on activities that are productive for the student, and that's the really important point.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question here from Sandia Paul. Sandy is asking, he teaches the IB curriculum, and he's asking about how we get students, students even at the highest level, how do we get them all to the highest level, even if they're working hard and they're not getting there? How can he motivate his students to keep going to try and get, particularly the IB curriculum? Sorry, Chris, you're about to
Yeah,
talk.
no, the IB curriculum, I mean, it is quite tricky to teach if you're not used to that sort of curriculum, because it does have some very challenging and searching questions. And how I've seen it done well is when teachers, when they've got a group or some of the students who maybe would falter somewhat on those challenging questions, they just break those questions down into smaller questions. Deal with those and then help them make connections to put that together, so they gain confidence and realise at the end of the lesson or at the end of a couple of lessons they have answered that big question that they start from. So it starts off with, this is a question, are we alone in the universe is a big question, and you can either answer it simply and not get very far, or you can unpick it and think what that means and then put all those ideas together. Teachers who do that usually manage to take all kids with them, and they differentiate as they go. So that's possibly what you need to do.
Yeah, and my only other thought to add to that was maybe some of our thinking organisers that we've talked about.
Oh yeah.
Might help as well. Structure, you might have to use different thinking organisers for different
Yeah.
students to help them, as Chris said, make those links and start putting the big picture together, because it can be too complex for some to actually know where to even start the thinking. So if you use some thinking organisers that help them over time, and as we said, over time, you might be able to take those away so they can scaffold and know how they learn to help them support themselves in the future with different questions.
Yeah, I've already got that Venn diagram that you use in my head with, are we alone in the universe? Evidence that says we are, evidence that says we're not, then evidence in the middle that says possibly, I don't know, and thinking about how I might deal with that. So, I'm already using one in my head to try and answer that question. You do the same with the kids.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so thank you, Sandy. I hope that helps. And if it does, please let us know on the course. Is from Nicola Crawford, and Nicola is asking particularly about hinge questions. So we had some hinge questions as part of our diagnostic week, so as an idea there. She was asking, can we share, so this is you Chris, can you share your thoughts on which of the questions you think are suitable as hinge questions and why? Because she's someone who's new to it and would appreciate some advice before she gets the rest of her team involved.
Okay, so hinge point questions are really difficult to craft. So some of the ones we've seen have made a good start but need some work on them, and it's one of the things that we're thinking of doing some work on over the next few months. But find a hinge point question that seems you and your colleagues think will work, and then just try it out in the classroom. That's the final test for it. What is important is when you have tried it out, to then monitor what happens afterwards to see whether or not that hinge point question really did do what you'd hoped it would do, and really does direct your learners to an appropriate task afterwards. And really just take forward those students that maybe you were worried about, were a little bit unsure whether they've got it or not. Has the actual action done that? And then use that information next time as well to guide you.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. So thank you, Nicola, for that question. Also, Nicola, I don't know if you're aware or if anybody else who wants to explore further hinge questions, that the sister course that we run, Assessment for Learning in STEM Teaching, focuses very much on dialogue in the classroom and when to ask particular questions for a particular purpose. And one of those questions that we look at is hinge questions, and there's a lot more detail on that. There'll be another iteration of that course, and if you Google FutureLearn and AFL, you'll be able to pick up when the next version of it will be running. So if you want to do that,
31st of October.
31st of October.
31st of October.
So if you want to do that, and get your team involved doing it, that'd be a really good way for all of you to develop your practice. And as Chris says, reflect on how they go in practice in the classroom. So I would highly recommend that for you and your team. So thank you very much. Okay, moving on to Carol Holden. So again, a similar question here. She appreciates how the differentiation will help the students, particularly those who are out of their depth to cope long term, but her question is how she manages the variety of tasks when she's got no TAs and some of her students have got entrenched behavioural problems. And also she says that the school she works in is not nearly as resourced as those shown here. So any guidance about making that transition? I think you've already mentioned a couple of things about practicing with one idea. But
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the other thing is, sometimes you have to think pragmatically and think how many different ways do I need to differentiate. Maybe you just need to sort of just do 2 different ways and split the class into 2. Not necessarily saying half and half. It might be that 20% of them move on to one thing and the other 80% do a particular thing, and then you take that and think about how are they doing. As the 20% get on, maybe you then can work with your 80% and divide them up a little bit and give them different types of support to get them through. So it's really finding ways that work for you and simplifying things if you have got classes that are not settling down to the work, or if you are a bit light on resources, as you seem to suggest. Yeah, so tailor it to your own context, really, is what I think is best for all.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. So that's something that I think that's coming out again. We're getting some themes coming out from the responses and the ideas. So thank you very much, Carol. Our next question.
Neil Fletcher says, as a maths teacher in a school that is looking to develop a mastery approach to the subject, will the differentiation tasks that I need to develop have to reflect a series of different routes rather than developing tasks with an increasing level of cognitive demand that students opt into or are directed towards? He asks, can a mastery approach be supported by differentiation, or are the 2 approaches in conflict? I think in mathematics and indeed in science, whether we use differentiation by task or differentiation by outcome depends on the particular material. So sometimes differentiation by task will be more appropriate, sometimes differentiation by outcome will be more appropriate. But to these 2 approaches, what I sometimes call the degree of difficulty and the marks for style approaches, it's worth also thinking about a 3rd way of differentiating. This is what Alistair Pollitt and Aisha Ahmed call the support model. So rather than just giving students a task that everybody can begin but very few students complete, or give different tasks, some easy, some hard, what we do is to see how much support a student needs to complete the task to a high level. This could be supported by the teacher, but it could be supported by online resources or other available materials. It could be supported by peers. The important point is that the student's experience using this support model for differentiation is that they do get to complete the task, which is a positive experience, and the differentiation comes in the amount of support that they're given to do so. And that leads to a better experience of learning for the student. But the important point is to match the model of differentiation to the particular kind of task at hand.
Chris is from Shashila Nagarajan. Apologies if I pronounce people's names wrong. I do apologise. Shashila's question is, she's talking about, and this is about student motivation really, which was one of our principles in our first week. What do you do if the child wants to do the less challenging task? How does the teacher deal with this action? And how will you be scaffolding the child's learning?
I think sometimes just let them do it. I mean, it depends really on your relationship with that child and what they've been like before. But, start them off on the tasks that they think. And as you see that they're speeding along with it, or maybe, they're not settling down to work, that's your cue to go in and say, is this really right for you? How about trying this one? And encourage them to have a go at it. Sometimes it's just fear of trying something that they might fail at. But really that's what we want them to go for. We don't want them to go for all the things they can easily do. We want them to occasionally go for challenges because that's how they learn. So finding that sort of way in where you can have an interaction with them that doesn't stop the rest of the class learning. So let them make a start, step in when it's the appropriate time. That's when the intervention is needed to move them forward. And then next time, just put the one you want them to do in front of them and they'll probably just get on with it. They are quite willing, most kids are, to fit in with what you want, as long as they don't get shown up in front of their peers, and that's what's the fear for most learners.
Yeah, absolutely. So there you go, some great advice there. Thank you very much for that question.
Bella Vartovo asks, what do I use to ascertain my learners' potential and drive them to higher grounds? Well, I think the idea of potential is actually quite a dangerous idea, because to have any idea of a student's potential we have to have some idea that where they are right now determines where they can be. And the evidence just doesn't support that idea. It turns out that there's no limit to what a student can achieve if they're willing to work hard enough and long enough at the task. So I think potential can be used in a way that doesn't actually help learning very much. I think the key idea here is that we embrace students in this idea that smart is not something you are, smart is something you get. There is no limit to what you could achieve if you work hard enough. And in particular, mistakes and setbacks are evidence that the work I gave you is tough enough to make you smarter. So I think we have to get students to understand, as many students understand with physical exercise, if it's not hard, it's not making you stronger. And in the same way, in mathematics, in science, if it's not hard, it's not making you smarter. I think this idea of getting students to embrace the challenge and the difficulty, because this is making you a smarter person, a better scientist, a better mathematician, that's the key idea.
So, moving on to Bella Wartova, who's asked a few questions. I know that Dylan's answered a couple of these, Bella. So the one for you, Chris, is learners are unique.
Yeah.
What would be the best unified formative approach that will help minimise time constraints and curriculum deadlines while gathering learning evidence? And I know that Dylan answered a couple of questions on this, which I think is people being worried that they have to get through so much curriculum with a deadline of an exam or whatever at the end. So what's your thoughts, Chris?
Well, one thing I can promise you is that if you get your assessment for learning, you get differentiation right, then the kids start doing a lot of learning for themselves. And that means that they can tackle the curriculum with you rather than you feeling you've got to drag them through the curriculum. So it does get better the more you get into these sorts of approaches. I think the thing to do really is to find some good questions, whether they're hinge point questions or whether they're just good questions that get kids talking. Because that diagnosis of their needs early on is absolutely key. If you can get that right, then the responsive teaching that you do through differentiation is going to be that much more effective. And that's going to save you time in the long run and help you get through the curriculum more effectively and more confidently. And that's particularly important, both for you to feel that you can move on with the students with their learning, but also the students feel that they're with you rather than being dragged along to speed they can't cope with. So good questions are really key to this.
Absolutely, thank you. Something else as well, Bella, because I've read Chris and Dylan have done work previously where they've talked about as well, what are the key ideas of your curriculum? What are the building blocks and the foundations the students have to know, and really making sure that you drive home those and that they understand those, and that some other things actually they may be beneficial, but actually not the foundations that they need. So it's the stuff that you teach as well that you're assessing is really important too.
Yeah.
Okay, so I hope that helps.
Bella asks a related question, which is, how do I systematically select the appropriate diagnostic tests that will be a possible remedy to identifying key areas for learners' development? And my advice would be not to worry too much about tests. A diagnostic test can very quickly generate more information than you can deal with in a month. So I would focus on hinge questions, this idea of checking a whole class's understanding on a key point during the teaching. And if you do that, then you can refer students to students who've already understood it. You can reteach things that a substantial number of students are failing to understand. And the best way to do this, I think, the best way to develop these good diagnostic questions is for a group of 3 or 4 teachers to work on a question with a key idea that if students are getting it right, they're getting it right for the right reason. So it's highly unlikely that students would get it right for the wrong reason. And when they think their question is ready, they refer it to another group of 3 or 4 teachers whose task is to try to find a way a student could get the right answer with the incorrect conceptual understanding. And if those second group of teachers can do that, then the question is returned to the first group of teachers for further work. But if they can't figure out a way that a student could get it right for the wrong reason, then it's ready for trying out in classrooms. And this is something that the Diagnostic Mathematics or Diagnostic Questions project has looked at very carefully. What we did back in the 2000s was to get students to write their reasons for the choices they'd made. And then teachers could check that the questions were working in the way that they were intended to work. So the main steps are design the question, shred or destruction test it with another group of teachers and get one group of students to answer the question, giving their reasons for their choice. That will enable you very rapidly to develop quite a large bank of questions.
So, Sana Zulkarnain wants to know how a curriculum, again, she or he they're asking about book free and time bound, but the question I thought we'd pick up on is, do you need to differentiate every time, or can we just use it alternatively?
I wouldn't try and sort of fit it into a pattern. I mean,
No.
I think it's just seeing whether something's appropriate. I mean, there are times when maybe the students can access things at a similar rate together on a few bits. And then when you start to question them about what understanding they've got, that's when you find out whether you need to scaffold or not their learning and help them move forward with their ideas. So possibly while they're getting the information for those emerging ideas, then no, you don't need to differentiate. But once you're starting to question and find out what those emerging ideas are, that's when you start differentiating. Then students can move at the rate they need to so that they can all learn and they can all reach their full potential.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, Sana. It's the fact that you can't differentiate till you've done something first. So it's not that presumption.
Yeah.
It's that eliciting evidence.
Yeah.
And then actually doing some differentiating as a consequence of what you find out.
Yeah.
So that's really useful. So thank you for that, Sana. We have a question from Diane Walsh. The bit that I'm going to ask you to think about, Chris, because we've looked at how regularly would you recommend. I think you've already answered that.
Yeah.
It's about planning. So she says she spends a fair amount of her weekends planning lessons now. And as good as some of these strategies sound, she wonders how she can manage the planning of those and have a work-life balance, I think is what she's asking.
I need advice on that myself, actually. I'm not very good at that side of it. But yeah, I think possibly one of the things that you need to do is to plan in a general way the main steps that you're going to take during that week with your learners. And then the focus should be just on refining those as you're collecting evidence from your learners as to which ones you need to focus on and strengthen and which other ones can you just sort of either let slip a bit or maybe can put off for another week. So it's just finding regular time to do it, but only short bursts of time to do the planning and not to do, which I see many of the young teachers that I work with on teacher training do, which is spend hours searching on the internet for things. Find your resources from other colleagues who've probably got a lot either on their computer or in their cupboards in the classrooms. And then think about the best way to use them. That's what you should spend your time planning, how to use resources effectively and not spending a lot of time searching for resources. Yeah.
So great advice. So it's the use of them and not necessarily the resource. I hope that helps, Diane.
Yvonne Bengover says that in her educational context, they have examinations that are meant to be differentiated by allocating a certain number of marks for each level in the assessment. But some students don't get there. And this is going to happen. The point is that differentiation can help us narrow the gap, but it's highly unlikely that anything can close the gap entirely. Some students find learning school stuff really easy, others find it much more difficult, and they have to work harder at it. So nothing that you do as a teacher is going to completely eradicate the gap in achievement between the highest and the lowest. What it can do is make sure that the lowest achievers are making progress, that they are developing the right kinds of attitudes towards work, that they're developing those metacognitive skills that allow them to monitor their own learning much more effectively. And if they stick at it, they will make progress. They may not find it as easy as others, but they will continue to make progress. And that's the really important takeaway from all the work on differentiation.
Thank you. Our next question is from Warren McIntyre. Warren asks, in a group activity, how do you stop one or more members doing nothing and just riding the wave of the others' work?
I think you have to really check whether they are doing nothing or are they just listening. Not all learners, when they participate, actually actively say things. We would all like them to because we want to know what's inside their heads. But you do get some students, both weak and strong students, who are thinking, listening and thinking and working out their ideas. So what I would tend to do is, as I was going around and noticing that a couple of times, maybe just occasionally sort of asking a particular student, what did they think of what the previous student has said, or can you add to what somebody has said? Those sorts of subsidiary questions that we use all the time in an assessment for learning classroom, because that's what will actually help you to know that they actually are keeping up with the learning that's going on. And if they are sort of falling asleep, it just gives them that jolt to move them forwards. You see teachers using that a lot in the classroom. But then, they can join in with the differentiated approach, even if they're not actively talking in the classroom. They still might be following the ideas. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. So there you go, Warren. So some